The screaming started at 0347 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk. Major Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the reinforced glass of the command tower, watching orange flames dance across what had been a peaceful village just 12 hours ago. The acrid smell of burning fuel and something far worse seeped through the building's ventilation system, making her stomach clench. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Jesus Christ, whispered Captain Marcus Chun, his voice barely audible over the radio chatter crackling from every speaker in the room. How many civilians are trapped in there? Elena's fingers traced the silver compass her grandfather had given her, the one that had guided him through 3 wars and somehow always pointed toward hope, even when there wasn't any to be found. The metal was warm against her palm, worn smooth by decades of desperate prayers and impossible decisions. She'd carried it through every mission for 8 years, but tonight it felt heavier than usual. General Patricia Hawthorne stood at the center of the chaos, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun that hadn't moved despite the 12-hour crisis briefing. Her voice cut through the din with military precision. I need options, people. Real options, not fairy tales. The situation was a nightmare wrapped in barbed wire and dipped in jet fuel. Rebel forces had overrun the small mountain village of San Esperanza, using the civilian population as human shields while they fortified themselves in the old colonial church that sat at the village's heart. Intelligence reports counted at least 40 families trapped inside, mothers, children, elderly grandparents who couldn't run fast enough when the shooting started. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the minefield. Decades ago, during the last Civil War, both sides had seeded the narrow valley approaches to San Esperanza with anti-personnel mines. The maps were lost, destroyed in bureaucratic shuffles and government collapses. What remained was local knowledge, whispered warnings about where children had vanished, where farmers refused to graze their cattle, where even the wild animals wouldn't venture. Elena studied the tactical display, her pilot's mind automatically calculating angles and distances. The village sat in a bowl-shaped valley, surrounded by steep mountains on 3 sides. The only road in or out wound through a narrow pass that intelligence confirmed was still heavily mined. Overhead satellite imagery showed the rebels had positioned surface-to-air missiles around the church, making any traditional air rescue impossible. Ground assault is out of the question, reported Colonel James Rivera, pointing at the map with a red laser dot that trembled slightly in his weathered hand. Rivera had been fighting wars since before Elena was born, and she'd never seen him look this grim. We'd lose half our people just getting to the village perimeter. And even if we made it through, the rebels have clear sight lines from that bell tower. It would be a massacre. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, barely 25 with earnest brown eyes that reminded Elena of her younger sister, leaned forward from her position at the communications console. Sir, what about helicopter extraction? If we could create a diversion, with what helicopter? General Hawthorne's voice carried the weight of impossible mathematics. The closest birds are 8 hours away, and those SAM sites would swat them down before they cleared the valley rim. We've run every simulation. There's no clean approach vector. Elena watched the satellite feed refresh every 30 seconds. Each update bringing new horrors. Smoke was getting thicker. The rebels were systematically moving through the village, herding more civilians into the church. Time was running out with each tick of the wall clock that seemed to echo louder than the radio static. Captain Chun pulled up the weather report on his tablet, his face illuminated by the blue glow. Storm front moving in from the west. We'll lose visibility completely within 6 hours. If we don't move soon. He didn't need to finish. They all knew what happened to civilians when rebel groups felt cornered and desperate. Elena found herself thinking about the letter in her flight suit pocket, the one her daughter Sophia had written for school about what her mommy did for work. "My mom flies planes to help people who are far away from home," it read in careful 8-year-old handwriting. "She says sometimes the best way to help someone is to do something that looks impossible." "Ma'am," Morrison spoke up again, her voice stronger this time. "What if we're thinking about this wrong? What if instead of trying to avoid the minefield, we used it?" The room fell silent except for the persistent hum of electronics and distant artillery. General Hawthorne turned slowly, her pale blue eyes focusing on the young lieutenant like a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. "Explain." Morrison stood, her hands shaking slightly as she pointed to the topographical display. "The village has an old airstrip, built during the colonial period, abandoned for 30 years. It runs east-west along the valley floor, parallel to the church." Rivera leaned forward, squinting at the map. "That strip hasn't been maintained in decades. Even if it was clear, it's too short for anything we've got. You'd need a pilot with a death wish and an aircraft that could stop on a dime." Elena felt something electric run down her spine, the same sensation she'd experienced the first time she'd seen an F-16 Falcon slice through a mountain pass, impossible and beautiful, and defying every law of physics that should have applied. Her grandfather's compass seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm. "How short are we talking?" she heard herself ask. The room's attention shifted to her like a spotlight. Elena was known for her steady hands and steadier voice, but right now she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd flown combat missions over 3 continents, executed precision strikes in conditions that made veteran pilots weep. But something about this moment felt different, bigger, like the kind of moment her grandfather had described when he talked about the war, when everything you thought you knew about yourself got stripped away, and you discovered what you were really made of. Morrison's fingers flew across her tablet, pulling up detailed measurements. 1,500 meters, ma'am. But that's assuming both ends are clear. With the suspected mine positions, she swallowed hard. Maybe 1,200 meters of guaranteed safe landing space. Elena closed her eyes, visualizing the approach. An F-16 needed at least 1,800 meters for a standard landing. Morph conditions were less than perfect. But she'd spent hundreds of hours in simulators, practicing short field landings that weren't supposed to be possible. Her instructors had called it a waste of time. Her grandfather had called it preparation for the day when impossible became the only option available. "The mines are actually an advantage," she said quietly, opening her eyes to find everyone staring at her. "They've kept the rebels from fortifying the airstrip. If I could get down there, put down right in the middle of their defensive perimeter. General." Hawthorne's expression was unreadable. "Major Vasquez, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Elena's mouth felt dry, but her voice came out steady. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the only way through hell is to fly straight into it, ma'am." Captain Chun shook his head vigorously. "Elena, that's suicide. Even if you managed the landing, which is impossible, you'd be surrounded, outnumbered, and trapped in a minefield. How would you even take off again?" The question hung in the air like cordite smoke. Elena looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over years of joint operations, good people, smart people, all trying to solve an unsolvable equation. She thought about Sophia's letter again, about her grandfather's stories of impossible choices that defined the difference between who you thought you were and who you really were when everything else got stripped away. "I don't know," she admitted. "But 40 families are going to die if we do nothing. And sometimes not knowing the answer to the second question doesn't mean you skip the first one." The silence stretched longer this time, broken only by radio reports from forward observers, who were running out of ways to say that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Elena could see the mental calculations happening behind everyone's eyes, the risk assessment, The probability matrices, the cold mathematics of military decision-making. Finally, General Hawthorne spoke, her voice careful and measured. "Major, even if I were willing to authorize such a mission, which I am not saying I am, what would you do once you were on the ground? One pilot against 50 armed rebels?" Elena pulled out her phone and showed them Sophia's school photo, gap-toothed grin, pigtails slightly askew, eyes bright with the kind of faith that adults spend their whole lives trying to remember how to feel. "I'd figure it out, ma'am. Because that's what we do when people need us to do the impossible." The photograph seemed to change something in the room's atmosphere. Morrison was nodding slowly. Rivera was studying the tactical display with new intensity. Even Chun, despite his objections, was pulling up aircraft specifications on his computer. But it was General Hawthorne's expression that mattered most. Elena had served under her for 3 years and had learned to read the subtle shifts in her commander's face, like a pilot reads instruments in a storm. What she saw, there wasn't approval, not yet, but it wasn't dismissal either. "Run the numbers," Hawthorne ordered finally. "All of them. I want fuel calculations, payload options, approach vectors, contingency plans for every variable you can think of. And I want them in 30 minutes. As the room exploded into activity, Elena found herself staring out the window again at the distant flames. Her grandfather's compass was still warm in her palm, and for just a moment, she could swear she felt it pulling her toward something, not magnetic north, but true north. The kind of direction that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the choices that define who you really are. When the world is burning and someone needs to fly into the darkness, the screaming from the valley was getting louder. Elena's hands were steady as she filled out the mission planning worksheet, but her mind was racing through 1,000 variables, each one carrying the weight of lives she'd never met, but had somehow become responsible for. The numbers on the page told a story that should have ended with her walking away. Fuel consumption rates, minimum runway requirements, structural stress limitations of an F-16 under emergency landing conditions. Everything her training had taught her said, this mission was impossible, but training had never prepared her for the sound of children crying through radio static, or the way her grandfather's compass seemed to pull her toward decisions that defied every regulation in the pilot's handbook. She thought about the morning 6 months ago, when Sophia had asked her why she chose to fly fighters instead of passenger planes like her friend's dad. They'd been sitting at the breakfast table, sunlight streaming through the kitchen window of their small base housing unit, and Elena had struggled to find words an 8-year-old would understand. "Sometimes," she'd finally said, stirring honey into her daughter's oatmeal, "there are people and places that are hard to reach. And sometimes those people need help that only certain kinds of planes can bring them." Sophia had nodded solemnly, the way children do when they're processing concepts that feel too big for their small understanding, but somehow make perfect sense anyway. Like when I'm scared at night and you come to my room even though it's dark. "And you don't like scary movies?" The memory made Elena's chest tighten. Sophia had been staying with Elena's mother in Arizona for the past month while Elena completed her deployment rotation. They talked every night over video chat, and Sophia always asked the same question. "When are you coming home, Mommy?" Elena always gave the same answer. "As soon as I can, baby. As soon as I can." But what did home even mean when children were dying in a valley 200 miles away? Elena's daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of briefings, training flights, equipment checks, and the kind of administrative paperwork that made her wonder if the military had been designed by people who had never actually fought a war. She woke at 5:00 every morning, ran 5 miles through the desert heat that reminded her of summers spent at her grandfather's ranch in New Mexico, then spent an hour in the base gym working through the same weightlifting routine she'd maintained. For 10 years, the physical training was meditation for her, repetitive motion that let her mind wander through problems she couldn't solve with muscle memory alone. This morning, she'd found herself thinking about the village of San Esperanza, trying to visualize the approach vector, the terrain, the 1,000 tiny decisions that would have to be made in split seconds while flying a $30 million aircraft into conditions that weren't supposed to be survivable. Her fellow pilots thought she was crazy, but they respected the kind of crazy that came with 8 years of flawless performance reviews and a reputation for making impossible shots when the mission required them. Captain Maria Rodriguez had pulled her aside after the morning briefing, her dark eyes serious in a way that reminded Elena of her own reflection. "You're not actually considering this insanity, are you?" Rodriguez had asked, her voice low enough that the other pilots couldn't overhear. "Because if you are, I want you to know that I've got 2 kids and a husband who depend on me coming home. And I cannot be the one to explain to Sofia why her mother decided to fly into a minefield for people she's never met." The words had stung because they carried the weight of truth. Elena did have a daughter who needed her. She did have a life waiting for her back home, a small house with a garden she'd never had time to properly tend, a stack of Sofia's artwork taped to the refrigerator, a future that looked nothing like the burning valley visible from the command tower window. But she also had the memory of her grandfather's voice, gravelly from 60 years of cigarettes and desert wind, telling her stories about the war in the Pacific. "The hardest thing about being a soldier," he'd said during one of their long walks through the high desert behind his ranch, "isn't learning how to fight. It's learning when fighting is the right choice and when walking away is the brave thing to do." She'd been 12 years old and hadn't understood what he meant. Now, filling out mission parameters for a flight that violated every safety protocol she'd ever learned, she was beginning to grasp the terrible mathematics of moral courage. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Sofia drew you a picture today. Says it's your plane bringing people home safe. She's very proud of her pilot, Mommy." The attached image showed a stick figure with long dark hair standing next to something that might have been an F-16 if you squinted, and had the generous heart of an 8-year-old. Above the drawing, in Sofia's careful letters, were the words, "My mom helps people even when it's scary." Elena set the phone aside and tried to focus on fuel calculations, but her mind kept drifting to the contradictions that defined her life. She was a warrior who spent most of her time in meetings, a mother who'd missed more soccer games than she'd attended, a woman in a profession that still raised eyebrows in certain parts of the country. Despite decades of proven capability, the truth was that she'd become a pilot because flying was the only thing that had ever made complete sense to her. In the air, physics was honest. Cause and effect followed predictable patterns. Good decisions led to good outcomes, and bad decisions killed you quickly, enough that you couldn't make the same mistake twice. But this mission existed in the space between those clean equations, a place where good decisions might still lead to tragedy, where the physics of flight had to compete with the physics of human desperation. She thought about Lieutenant Morrison, barely out of flight school, eyes bright with the kind of optimism that hadn't yet been worn down by the slow realization that most military problems didn't have clean solutions. Elena remembered feeling that same electric confidence during her first combat deployment, the absolute certainty that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle. Experience had taught her that determination without wisdom was just another way to get people killed. But experience had also taught her that wisdom without courage was just another way to watch people die while you made calculations. Her grandfather had flown P-51 Mustangs in World War II, missions over Europe that he'd described in fragments, never complete stories. The thing about flying into trouble, he'd told her once while they worked on his old pickup truck, is that you've got to trust your instruments, even when what you're seeing out the window doesn't make sense. Especially when what you're seeing doesn't make sense. Elena pulled up the weather reports again, studying wind patterns and visibility forecasts that would determine whether this impossible mission became merely suicidal or completely unthinkable. The storm front was moving faster than initially predicted. They had maybe 4 hours of flyable weather left, 4 hours to decide whether she was the kind of person who could live with walking away from 40 families who were counting on anyone to do something impossible. 4 hours to decide whether she was the kind of mother who could look her daughter in the eye and explain why sometimes the right choice was the one that guaranteed she'd never come home. Elena's hands were still steady as she finished the calculations, but inside, she felt like she was already falling through thin air, waiting to discover whether her wings were strong enough to carry her through the storm. The briefing room had transformed into a war council that felt more like a wake. Elena spread the mission parameters across the conference table while General Hawthorne studied each document with the intensity of someone reading her own death warrant. The numbers told a story that should have ended the discussion before it began, but the radio reports from San Esperanza kept coming in, each update making the impossible seem more necessary. Fuel consumption puts you at absolute minimum reserves for a return flight, reported Captain Chun, his voice tight with professional concern. That's assuming perfect weather conditions and no combat maneuvering. One evasive action, one engine hiccup, and you're committed to a dead-stick landing wherever you can find flat ground. Elena nodded, marking notes in the margins of her flight plan. She'd run the calculations 17 different ways, adjusting for every variable she could think of. The math was unforgiving. What about payload options? Lieutenant Morrison pulled up the armament configurations on her tablet, her young face grave with the responsibility of planning someone else's potential death. Standard air-to-ground package gives you 4 AGM-65 Mavericks and a full load of 20mm cannon rounds. But that's additional weight on an already marginal fuel situation. What's our intelligence on rebel defensive positions? Elena asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. Colonel Rivera activated the overhead projector, filling the wall with satellite imagery that looked like a tactical nightmare painted in high definition. Red dots marked confirmed. Enemy positions, yellow triangles indicated suspected surface-to-air missile sites, and blue squares showed the probable locations of civilian concentrations. At least 50 armed combatants, possibly more, Rivera reported, using a laser pointer to trace defensive perimeters around the village. They've fortified the church bell tower with heavy machine guns and positioned RPG teams at every approach. To the village center, SAM sites here, and here. The red dot traced a triangle around the valley. Shoulder-fired missiles, probably Russian-made Iglas, effective up to 12,000 feet. Elena studied the display, her pilot's mind, automatically calculating attack angles and escape routes that didn't exist. What about the civilians' latest count? Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper. 47 confirmed inside the church, 19 children under the age of 12. The rebels are using them as human shields, positioning themselves in windows and doorways where we can't engage without risking civilian casualties. The weight of those numbers settled over the room like a physical presence. Elena found herself thinking about Sophia's classmates, their bright faces during the school play last spring, the way they'd waved at her when she'd picked Sophia up in uniform, the absolute trust in their eyes when they'd asked if she was a real pilot who flew real planes. General Hawthorne cleared her throat, her command voice cutting through the emotional undertow. Major Vasquez, I need you to walk me through this step by step. How do you see this mission playing out? Elena stood, approaching the tactical display with her grandfather's compass still warm in her palm. Phase 1 is the approach. I'll come in low and fast from the east, using the mountain ridges to mask my radar signature. The SAM sites are positioned to defend against conventional attack vectors, high-altitude approaches from the south and west. By coming in at treetop level from the mountains, I can avoid their engagement envelope until the final approach to the airstrip. Rivera frowned, adjusting his reading glasses to study the topographical lines. That approach takes you through some nasty terrain. Updrafts and downdrafts off those peaks and flip an F-16 like a pancake. And at that altitude, you've got zero margin for error. That's why it might work, Elena replied. They're not expecting anyone to be crazy enough to thread that needle. The element of surprise is the only advantage we have. Captain Chun was shaking his head slowly, the way he did when he was trying to solve engineering problems that violated the laws of physics. Okay, let's say you make it through the mountains and get lined up with the airstrip. You're talking about a landing that requires every system on your aircraft to perform perfectly. No margin for error, no opportunity for a go-around if the approach goes wrong. One miscalculation and you're a crater in a minefield. Elena had run those calculations so many times the numbers were burned into her memory. I'll be coming in hot and heavy, full reverse thrust the instant the wheels touch down. Maximum brake pressure, drag chute deployed, everything the aircraft can give me to get stopped in 1,200 meters. And then? General Hawthorne's question carried the weight of command decision. You're on the ground, surrounded by hostiles, with civilians trapped in a building you can't assault without causing the casualties you're trying to prevent. What's your tactical plan? This was the part of the mission that existed in the space between training and improvisation, where tactical doctrine met the ugly realities of asymmetric warfare. Elena looked around the room at faces that reflected her own uncertainty. I don't have a complete tactical plan, ma'am, but I have the beginning of one. She turned to face the group, her voice gaining strength as she talked through ideas that had been forming in the back of her mind. The rebels aren't expecting a lone pilot to land in the middle of their defensive perimeter. That surprise gives me maybe 10 minutes before they reorganize and respond. Lieutenant Morrison leaned forward, her strategic mind engaging with the problem. 10 minutes to do what exactly? Create chaos, Elena replied. Force them to divide their attention between defending against an external threat and maintaining control of the hostages. If I can disrupt their defensive positions, create enough confusion and uncertainty, maybe I can give the civilians an opportunity to escape. Rivera was nodding slowly, his experienced eye seeing possibilities that the younger officers were still processing. It's not a terrible idea tactically. Small unit infiltration behind enemy lines, attacking their command and control structure rather than trying to fight them head-on. But you're still talking about one pilot against 50 armed combatants. Elena's phone buzzed with another message from her mother. This time it was a video Sophia practicing piano, her small fingers carefully picking out the melody to amazing grace, while she sang along in a voice that cracked on the high notes, but carried perfect pitch on the ones that mattered. She watched her daughter's face, concentrated and serious as she worked through the difficult passages, and felt something crystallize in her chest. This wasn't about heroics or career advancement or proving anything to anyone. This was about the kind of world Sophia would inherit, whether it would be one where people in desperate situations could count on someone to try the impossible, or one where mathematical probabilities trumped moral imperatives. Ma'am, Elena said, turning back to General Hawthorne, I know the odds. I know this mission violates every safety protocol we have. But I also know that if we do nothing, 47 people are going to die, and 19 of them are children who deserve the same chance. Sophia has to grow up and learn piano and complain about homework and all the other ordinary miracles that make life worth living. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier tactical discussions. This was the silence that precedes decisions that can't be undone, the moment when abstract planning becomes concrete commitment. General Hawthorne studied Elena's face for a long moment, then turned to the tactical display. What do you need? From us? Elena felt her heartbeat accelerate, but her voice remained steady. Full pre-flight prep on my aircraft. I want every system checked twice, fuel topped off, and armament loaded for maximum versatility. I'll need real-time intelligence updates during the flight, any changes in enemy positions, weather conditions, civilian status. Done, Hawthorne replied. What else? I need a promise, Elena said, meeting her commander's eyes. If this goes wrong, if I don't make it back, I need to know that you'll tell Sophia that her mother tried to do the right thing, even when the right thing looked impossible. Captain Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the briefing, suddenly stood up. Ma'am, request permission to provide air cover for Major Vasquez's mission. Elena turned to her friend in surprise. Maria, you said— I know what I said, Rodriguez interrupted, her voice firm with decision. But I've been thinking about it, and you're right. Sometimes the only way to live with yourself is to do something that scares the hell out of you. I can't make that landing in a minefield, but I can damn sure make sure no SAM site gets a clean shot at you while you're trying. Lieutenant Morrison was nodding enthusiastically. Ma'am, I'd like to volunteer for communications and intelligence support. If Major Vasquez is going to be on the ground in hostile territory, she needs real-time updates and coordination that goes beyond standard radio protocol. Elena looked around the room at faces that had transformed from skeptical to determined. From professional to personal. These weren't just colleagues anymore. They were people who had chosen to make an impossible mission their own. General Hawthorne was quiet for another long moment, then reached for her secure phone. This is going to require authorization from levels above my pay grade. But I'm going to make the call. As Hawthorne left the room to begin the chain of command notifications that would either approve or kill the mission, Elena found herself alone with her team, her friends, who had decided to follow her into something that violated every rational assessment of risk versus reward. Outside, the storm clouds were building on the horizon, and the radio reports from San Esperanza were getting worse. The authorization came through at 13:47 hours, transmitted through encrypted channels that carried the weight of decisions made in rooms Elena would never see by people whose names she'd never know. General Hawthorne returned to the briefing room with the kind of expression that suggested the conversation had been neither easy nor pleasant. Washington has approved the mission, she announced, her voice carefully neutral, with conditions. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Military conditions were usually another way of saying that someone wanted plausible deniability when everything went wrong. What kind of conditions, ma'am? This is classified as a volunteer mission under emergency protocols. No pilot will be ordered to fly it. No pilot will face negative consequences for declining. And if it goes bad— Hawthorne paused, meeting Elena's eyes. If it goes bad, officially it never happened. The weight of those words settled over the room like smoke. Elena understood the politics a failed rescue mission in foreign territory could create, diplomatic complications that lasted for years. But she also understood the deeper message. She was being given permission to try the impossible, but she would be doing it without the full backing of the institution she'd served for 8 years. Lieutenant Morrison broke the silence first. Ma'am, what's the current situation in San Esperanza? Hawthorne activated the communications console, and immediately the room filled with radio traffic that painted a picture of escalating desperation. Forward observers reported increasing smoke from the village center, signs that the rebels were starting to execute whatever endgame they had planned. Intelligence estimates we have maybe 2 hours before they start eliminating hostages, reported Colonel Rivera, his weathered face grim with the mathematics of siege warfare. They're facing pressure from government forces approaching from the south, and they know they can't hold the position indefinitely. Elena studied the latest satellite imagery, noting changes in rebel positions that suggested they were preparing for a final assault or a fighting withdrawal. Either scenario ended badly for the civilians trapped in the church. What about our government force coordination? She asked. If I can create enough chaos on the ground, Can they accelerate their approach? Rivera shook his head. They're still 6 hours out, minimum. The mountain roads are worse than anticipated, and they're dealing with scattered resistance along the route. Even if your mission is completely successful, you'll be on your own until at least 2,100 hours. Elena pulled up the weather forecast on her tablet, checking wind conditions and visibility predictions that would determine whether her approach vector was merely dangerous or completely impossible. The storm front was moving faster than anticipated, bringing with it crosswinds that would make the landing even more challenging. Time to make a decision, Major, General Hawthorne said quietly. Aircraft is prepped and ready on the flight line. Weather window closes in 90 minutes. Elena looked around the room at faces that had become familiar over months of joint operations. Captain Chun, whose engineering expertise had helped her understand the technical limits of what she was attempting. Lieutenant Morrison, whose tactical analysis had identified the narrow window of opportunity. Colonel Rivera, whose experience had provided the sobering context of what she'd be facing on the ground. And Captain Rodriguez, who despite her earlier reservations was now suiting up to provide air cover for a mission that could easily kill them both. There's something I need to tell all of you, Elena said, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room go still. Something I haven't mentioned in the tactical planning. She pulled out her phone and showed them the latest video. From her daughter Sophia at her grandmother's kitchen table, working on homework while humming a song that Elena recognized as one they used to sing together during car rides. That's my daughter, Elena said unnecessarily, since they all knew about Sophia. She's 8 years old. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up because she says doctors help people feel better when they're scared. And she's been asking me for weeks when I'm coming home because she wants to show me the garden she's been planting with her grandmother. The room was silent except for the steady hum of electronic equipment and distant radio chatter. I'm telling you this, Elena continued, because I want you to understand what this decision means to me. I'm not doing this because I have a death wish or because I think I'm invincible or because I don't understand the risks. I'm doing this because I want to live in a world where Sophia can believe that, sometimes, when things look impossible, the right person in the right place can make a difference. Elena pocketed her phone and looked directly at General Hawthorne. Ma'am, request permission to proceed with the mission. Hawthorne studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Permission granted, Major. God help us all. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of pre-flight procedures that Elena had performed hundreds of times, but never under conditions that carried this much weight. She walked through the aircraft inspection with the same methodical attention to detail that had kept her alive through 8 years of combat missions, but every system check felt amplified by the knowledge that equipment failure wouldn't just mean an aborted mission. It would mean death in a minefield while children waited to be rescued. Her F-16 Fighting Falcon had been configured for maximum versatility. 4 AGM-65 Maverick missiles for precision strikes, a full load of 20mm cannon, ammunition, and electronic countermeasures designed to defeat the surface-to-air missile systems that would be hunting her from the moment she entered the valley. Captain Rodriguez was completing her own pre-flight procedures on the adjacent aircraft, her face set with the kind of grim concentration that Elena recognized from combat missions where the margin for error had been measured in milliseconds. You know, Rodriguez said, checking her helmet communication system, when we were at flight school, did you ever imagine we'd be doing something like this? Elena thought about those early days of training, when flying had been about precision, maneuvers and theoretical scenarios designed by instructors who had never faced the ugly realities of asymmetric warfare. I thought we'd be defending American airspace from clearly identified enemies flying aircraft that followed the same rules. We did. Simpler times, Rodriguez agreed. When the good guys and bad guys wore different uniforms and nobody used children as human shields. Elena finished her external inspection and climbed into the cockpit that had become as familiar as her own. Living room. The instrument panel glowed with dozens of indicators that told her everything about the health and status of the machine that would carry her into conditions that weren't supposed to be survivable. As she worked through the pre-start checklist, Elena found her mind drifting to her grandfather's stories about flying P-51 Mustangs over Europe. He'd never talked much about the fear that wasn't his generation's way of processing trauma, but he'd talked about the responsibility, the weight of knowing that people on the ground were counting on you to do something that required perfect execution under imperfect conditions. The thing about flying into trouble, he'd told her during one of their long walks through the desert behind his ranch, is that you can't think your way through it. You have to feel your way through it. Trust that your training and your instincts will carry you when your conscious mind starts telling you all the reasons why what you're doing is impossible. Elena engaged the engine start sequence and felt the familiar vibration as 30,000 pounds of thrust came online. The F-16 was a machine designed for precision violence, capable of speeds that turned landscape into blur and carrying weapons that could level city blocks. But today, it was just transportation away to get one pilot into an impossible situation where training met improvisation and the outcome couldn't be calculated in advance. Tower, Falcon 1 requesting clearance for immediate departure. She spoke into her helmet microphone, her voice calm despite the adrenaline that was making her hands shake slightly. Falcon 1, cleared for immediate departure. Runway 09. Winds light and variable. Weather reports show increasing cloud cover at your destination. Elena taxied toward the runway, her aircraft followed closely by Rodriguez's F-16. In her rearview mirror, she could see the control tower where General Hawthorne and the rest of the team were monitoring weather reports and intelligence updates. That would determine whether this mission remained merely dangerous or became completely hopeless. Falcon 2, this is Falcon 1. She transmitted to Rodriguez on their private channel. Thank you for this. You didn't have to volunteer for air cover duty. Rodriguez's voice came back steady and sure. Falcon 1, someone's got to make sure you don't get shot down before you have a chance to do something heroically stupid. Besides, my kids are going to ask me someday what I did during the war. I want to have a good answer. Elena lined up on the runway centerline, her engine spooling up to full military power. Through her canopy, she could see storm clouds building on the horizon, the weather front that would either provide cover for her approach or make the mission impossible to complete. Falcon 1 tower, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed. Major, Elena released the brakes and felt 30,000 pounds of thrust slam her back into her ejection seat. The F-16 accelerated down the runway with the violent grace of a machine designed to defy gravity, and within seconds she was climbing into thin air that tasted like possibility and fear in equal measure. At 15,000 feet, she banked toward the mountains that separated her from San Esperanza, with Rodriguez maintaining formation off her right wing. Below them, the landscape unfolded in patterns of desert and stone that had remained unchanged for millennia, indifferent to the human drama playing out in the valley beyond the peaks. Control Falcon 1. Approaching the mountain corridor, weather. Looks marginal but flyable. Request final intelligence update on target area. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through the radio with information that made Elena's stomach clench. Falcon 1, latest satellite imagery shows increased smoke from the village center. Forward observers report possible executions have begun. Estimate 30 minutes before rebel forces begin systematic elimination of remaining hostages. Elena felt time compress around her like the physical pressure of high-G maneuvers. 30 minutes to thread through mountain passes that should require an hour of careful navigation. 30 minutes to land on an abandoned airstrip surrounded by mines, while under fire from enemies who had nothing left to lose. Falcon 2, this is Falcon 1. beginning descent into the mountain corridor. Recommend you hold at Angels 15. And provide overwatch. Negative, Falcon 1. I'm coming with you as far as the valley approach. Someone needs to suppress those SAM sites while you're making your landing run. Elena wanted to argue, but she knew Rodriguez was right. The surface-to-air missiles positioned around the valley would have clear shots at her during the final approach. To the airstrip. Without suppression, she'd be flying into a kill zone with no chance of survival. The mountain passes were worse than the weather reports had suggested. Updrafts and downdrafts off the peaks threw Elena's F-16 around like a toy, forcing her to constantly adjust power settings and control inputs to maintain her planned route. The terrain rose around her aircraft in walls of stone that seemed close enough to touch, and the margin for error was measured in feet rather than the comfortable miles of high-altitude flight. "Jesus," Rodriguez transmitted, her voice tight, with concentration as she followed Elena through the twisting canyon that led towards San Esperanza. "I can see why nobody expected us to come this way. This is like threading a needle while riding a roller coaster." Elena's instrument panel showed the stress her aircraft was experiencing. Engine temperatures running high from the constant power adjustments. Airframe strain gauges registering forces that were within limits, but uncomfortably close to redline. Values. The F-16 was a tough machine, but it was being asked to perform in conditions that pushed every system to its design limits. Through gaps in the mountain peaks, she caught glimpses of the valley beyond a bowl of green surrounded by stone, with smoke rising from the cluster of buildings that marked San Esperanza. From this distance, it looked peaceful, like a postcard from a tourist destination rather than the site of a humanitarian crisis that was about to become a one-woman military operation. Falcon 1, this is Control. Latest weather update shows the storm front accelerating. You've got maybe 20 minutes of flyable conditions before visibility drops to 0. Elena checked her fuel gauge and calculated the mathematics of commitment. She had enough fuel for one approach to the airstrip, one attempt at landing, and if everything went perfectly, enough reserve to get back to base. There would be no second chances, no opportunity for a missed approach if the landing went wrong. Control, Falcon 1. Beginning final approach sequence. If you don't hear from me in 30 minutes, assume the mission has failed and commence search and rescue operations. Elena dropped her aircraft below the rim of the valley immediately, drawing fire from multiple positions around the village. Tracer rounds streaked past her canopy like deadly fireworks, and her threat warning system began screaming alerts about radar locks from the surface-to-air missile sites. Falcon 2 engaging SAM sites, Rodriguez transmitted, her F-16 diving toward the eastern ridge where one of the missile launchers was positioned. Falcon 1, you've got a clear corridor for about 60 seconds. Elena lined up her approach to the abandoned airstrip, which looked even shorter and more treacherous than the satellite images had suggested. Abandoned for 30 years, the pavement was cracked and overgrown with vegetation that would grab at her landing gear like grasping hands. At the far end, she could see the minefield that Colonel Rivera had warned her about: disturbed earth and rusted, warning signs that marked the boundary between possible survival and certain death. Her airspeed indicator showed 200 knots as she crossed the valley rim, too fast for a normal landing but necessary to minimize her exposure to ground fire. She deployed her speed brakes and felt the F-16 decelerate rapidly, the aircraft bucking and shaking as she forced it through a descent profile that violated every landing procedure she'd ever learned. Falcon 1, you've got multiple bogies converging. On the airstrip, Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. Estimate 20 armed rebels moving to intercept your landing zone. Elena could see muzzle flashes from the village as rebels realized what was happening and redirected their fire toward the airstrip. Bullets sparked off the pavement ahead of her aircraft, and she could hear the metallic impacts as rounds found her aircraft's armored fuselage set at 50 feet above the runway. Elena cut her throttles to idle and deployed her drag chute, feeling the violent deceleration as the parachute grabbed air and her wheels slammed onto the broken pavement. She stood on the brakes, maximum pressure that heated her brake discs to glowing red as she fought to stop 30,000 pounds of aircraft in 1,200 meters of usable runway. The F-16 shuddered and bucked as it decelerated, threatening to skid off the runway into the minefield that waited on both sides. Elena maintained directional control through a combination of rudder inputs and differential braking that required every bit of skill she developed over 8 years of flying high-performance aircraft. With less than 100 meters of runway remaining, the F-16 finally came to a stop in a cloud of smoke and burning rubber. Elena had made it down alive, but she was now sitting in a broken aircraft surrounded by enemies who were already moving to surround her position. She shut down her engines and began the emergency egress procedure, gathering the survival gear that would have to sustain her until government forces arrived, if they arrived. Through her canopy, she could see rebels emerging from cover positions around the village, their weapons trained on her aircraft. Control Falcon 1. I'm on them. Ground and operational. Beginning Phase 2 of the mission. Elena popped her canopy and climbed out of the cockpit, her boots hitting pavement that was still warm from her aircraft's brakes. Around her, the valley was eerily quiet except for the distant sound of gunfire and the closer sound of boots running. Across broken ground, she had made the impossible landing. Now came the even more impossible part, staying alive long enough to do something that mattered. Elena's boots hit the cracked pavement of the abandoned airstrip, and immediately the world exploded into chaos around her. Rifle fire cracked from multiple positions as rebels who had been taken completely by surprise began to react to the presence of an enemy fighter pilot in the middle of their defensive perimeter. She rolled behind her aircraft's landing gear, using the F-16's armored fuselage as cover while she assessed the tactical situation. Her grandfather's compass was a warm weight in her flight suit pocket, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice. When everything goes to hell, remember that the other side is just as confused as you are. The difference is, you chose to be here. Elena pulled her sidearm a standard-issue Beretta M9 that felt inadequate against the AK-47s that were chewing up the pavement around her position. But she also had something the rebels didn't expect, the element of surprise, and the kind of desperate determination that came from knowing that children were dying while she calculated survival odds. Control, Falcon 1 on the ground and taking fire, she transmitted into her radio headset. Beginning movement toward the village center. Falcon 2, what's your status on SAM suppression? Rodriguez's voice came back strained but controlled. Falcon 1, I've neutralized 2 SAM sites, but I'm taking heavy ground fire. I can give you maybe 5 more minutes of air cover before I have to egress due to fuel. Elena checked her watch. 5 minutes to cross 400 meters of open ground, neutralize or distract 50 armed rebels, and somehow create an opportunity for 47 civilians to escape from a fortified position. The mathematics were impossible, but mathematics had never accounted for the kind of moral physics that drove people to attempt things that couldn't be calculated in advance. She broke cover and began moving toward the village in short sprints, using abandoned farm equipment and stone walls as cover while rifle fire tracked her movement. Her radio crackled with updates from Lieutenant Morrison, who was coordinating intelligence from overhead surveillance. Falcon 1, rebel forces are repositioning to intercept you. Main concentration still around the church, but they're sending squads to flank your position. Elena reached the edge of the village proper, where narrow streets between stone buildings created a maze of potential ambush sites and escape routes. The architecture was colonial Spanish, built around a central plaza dominated by the church where the hostages were being held. Smoke was rising from several buildings, and she could hear the sound of breaking glass and shouted orders in Spanish. She paused behind a stone wall that surrounded what had once been a small garden, now overgrown with weeds that provided additional concealment. Through gaps in the vegetation, she could see rebel positions around the church, armed figures in windows and doorways, exactly as Colonel Rivera had predicted. But she could also see something the satellite imagery hadn't shown. Clearly, the rebels were scared. Their movements were erratic, undisciplined. They'd been expecting to fight government forces approaching through conventional routes, not a lone pilot who had literally dropped out of the sky into their midst. Elena's tactical training kicked in, analyzing the situation with the cold clarity that had kept her alive through combat missions on 3 continents. The rebels had superior numbers and defensive positions, but they'd lost the initiative. For the next few minutes, until they could reorganize and coordinate their response, she could dictate the terms of engagement. She keyed her radio. "Control, Falcon 1. I need you to patch me through to any government forces in the area. I have an idea, but I need coordination with ground elements." Morrison's voice came back immediately. "Falcon 1, connecting you to Colonel Santos, commanding the government relief column. Stand by." A new voice crackled through Elena's headset, older, speaking English with a heavy accent that carried the authority of someone who had been fighting wars since before Elena was born. "This is Colonel Santos." "Major, what is your situation?" Elena ducked as automatic weapons fire sparked off the stone wall above her head. "Colonel, I'm on the ground in San Esperanza, approximately 400 meters from the rebel positions around the church. I need to know your exact location and estimated time of arrival." "We are 6 kilometers south of the village, attempting to clear roadblocks and mine obstacles. Best estimate is still 3 hours before we can reach you." 3 hours. Elena looked at her watch and calculated ammunition, water, and the psychology of siege warfare. The rebels wouldn't wait 3 hours to start eliminating hostages, especially now that they knew government forces were approaching, and there was an enemy pilot loose in their midst. "Colonel, I have a proposal. If I can create enough chaos in their defensive perimeter, force them to concentrate on hunting me instead of controlling the hostages, can you accelerate your approach?" There was a pause before Santos responded. "Major, what exactly are you planning?" Elena studied the layout of the village, noting the positions of buildings that could provide cover, escape routes that might allow civilian evacuation, and choke points where a single person with the right equipment could create disproportionate tactical effects. "I'm planning to give them something more immediate to worry about than civilians they can't move anyway. If I can draw their attention away from the church, create enough confusion and casualties to disrupt their command structure, maybe the hostages can escape during the chaos." Elena could hear Santos conferring with his staff in rapid Spanish before he came back on the radio. "Major, we can advance our timeline to 90 minutes if you can maintain pressure on their positions. But you understand that once you begin active engagement, there will be no way to extract you until we arrive." "Understood, Colonel. Falcon 1 beginning active phase of operations." Elena checked her equipment one final time: pistol with 3 spare magazines, survival knife, emergency medical kit, and the small collection of personal items that had somehow seemed important when she was planning the mission. Her grandfather's compass was still warm in her pocket, and Sophia's school photo was tucked into her helmet band, where she could see it. She broke cover and began moving toward the church through the narrow streets that zigzagged between buildings centuries old. The rebels had positioned themselves to defend against conventional assault, with overlapping fields of fire that covered the main approaches to the plaza. But Elena wasn't planning a conventional assault. Her first target was a 2-story building on the eastern side of the plaza, where muzzle flashes indicated a machine gun position that commanded most of the square. Elena worked her way through the back streets, using her small size and military training to move through shadows and blind spots that wouldn't have concealed a larger force. The building's back entrance was a wooden door that had seen better decades. Elena tested the latch carefully, found it unlocked, and slipped inside what had once been someone's home. Family photographs still hung on the walls, children's birthday parties, wedding celebrations, the ordinary moments that made up a life. Before war arrived to rearrange everything, she could hear voices from the floor above. Two men discussing fields of fire and ammunition. Distribution in Spanish that Elena's high school language classes and military briefings allowed her to follow. They were confident, relaxed, treating this like a routine defensive mission rather than a desperate last stand. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Elena climbed the wooden stairs with careful attention to creaking boards that might give away her position. At the top, she found herself in a small bedroom that had been converted into a fighting position. Two rebels were stationed at the window overlooking the plaza. Their attention focused on the approaches to the church. What happened next lasted less than 10 seconds. Elena's military training took over, executing movements she'd practiced thousands of times in combat exercises, but had hoped never to use against actual human beings. When it was over, the machine gun position was silent, and Elena was in control of a vantage point that overlooked most of the rebel defensive perimeter. She keyed her radio. Control, Falcon 1 has neutralized the eastern overwatch position, beginning harassment operations. Elena positioned herself at the window and began engaging targets of opportunity with precise pistol fire that was intended more to create confusion than casualties. Each shot forced rebels to take cover, disrupted their communications, and created the impression that they were under attack from multiple directions. Falcon 2, this is Falcon 1. I could use some close air support if you've got any ordnance remaining. Rodriguez's voice came back tense with concentration. Falcon 1, I've got 2 Mavericks left, but I need clear target designation. Too many civilians in the area for indiscriminate strikes. Elena studied the rebel positions through the window, identifying targets that could be engaged without risking civilian casualties. Falcon 2, I've got a clear shot request. Rebel command post in the building with the red tile roof, northwest corner of the plaza. No civilian signatures in that structure. Copy, Falcon 1. Maverick inbound in 30 seconds. Take cover. Elena ducked below the windowsill as the GM-65 Maverick missile screamed overhead and impacted the designated building in an explosion that shook the entire village. When she looked up, the rebel command post had been reduced to rubble, and the coordinated defensive fire from around the plaza had dissolved into confused, undirected shooting. Direct hit, Falcon 2. Rebel command structure appears to be disrupted. Elena could see the effects immediately. Without centralized coordination, the rebel defenders were reacting individually to threats they couldn't identify, firing at shadows and sounds while their tactical cohesion collapsed. Several of them had abandoned their positions around the church to hunt for the infiltrator who was picking them off from unknown locations. More importantly, she could see movement around the church itself, civilians appearing in windows and doorways as the rebels' attention was diverted to the more immediate threat of enemy action in their midst. Control, Falcon 1. I can see hostages beginning to move. If government forces can accelerate their approach, we might have a window for civilian evacuation. Colonel Santos came back on the radio with updates that made Elena's heart race. Falcon 1, we have broken through the roadblocks. Estimate 45 minutes to your position. Can you maintain pressure until then? Elena looked at her remaining ammunition and calculated the mathematics of survival against overwhelming odds. I'll maintain pressure, Colonel, but I'm going to need some luck and probably a miracle. She left the building through the back door and began moving to her next position, a small shop on the southern edge of the plaza. That would give her a different angle of fire and force the rebels to continue dividing their attention between multiple threats. As she moved through the narrow streets, Elena found herself thinking about Sophia's letter again, the one where she'd written that sometimes the best way to help someone was to do something that looked impossible. At the time, Elena had thought her daughter was talking about bedtime stories and childhood fears. Now, crouched behind a stone wall while bullets chipped pieces of ancient masonry around her head, Elena realized that Sophia had understood something fundamental about courage that most adults spent their whole lives trying to figure out. Sometimes the right thing to do was the thing that scared you the most. 6 months later, Elena stood in the garden behind her mother's house in Arizona, watching Sophia carefully transplant tomato seedlings into rows that were almost perfectly straight. The late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of gold that reminded her of the way light had looked through the smoke and dust of San Esperanza during those 45 minutes that had changed everything. "Mom, do you think the tomatoes will remember being scared when we move them?" Sophia asked, her 8-year-old hands gentle with the fragile plants. Elena smiled, thinking about resilience and memory and the way living things adapted to circumstances they never could have anticipated. "I think they'll remember being cared for, even when everything else was uncertain." The rescue at San Esperanza had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. All 47 hostages had been evacuated safely, most of them during the chaos Elena had created by turning a defensive siege into a running firefight that stretched rebel forces beyond their ability to maintain control. Colonel Santos's government forces had arrived to find a village in the process of liberating itself, with civilians streaming out of the church while confused rebels fought shadows and sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Elena's grandfather's compass was still in her pocket, though these days it pointed toward different kinds of true north, parent-teacher conferences and soccer practices, and the ordinary miracles that made up a life lived far from combat zones. She'd been reassigned to a training position at Nellis Air Force Base, where she taught young pilots the kind of precision flying that might someday save lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. "The reporter wants to interview you again next week," her mother called from the kitchen window, where she was preparing dinner with the methodical care of someone who had spent decades feeding people she loved. Elena grimaced. The media attention had been overwhelming in the months following the Mission Network news interviews, magazine profiles, speaking engagements that treated her like some kind of action hero rather than a pilot who had gotten very lucky while trying to do the right thing. She declined most of the requests, preferring to let the story fade into the background noise of other people's entertainment. "Tell them I'm still not interested," Elena replied, helping Sophia water the newly transplanted seedlings. "This garden is more important than another news interview." Sophia looked up from her work, soil smudged on her cheek and serious expression that reminded Elena of her own face in childhood photographs. "Mom, do you miss flying the fighter planes?" It was a question Elena had been asking herself every day since the reassignment. She missed the precision of flight, the clarity of decisions that had to be made in milliseconds, the sense of purpose that came from belonging to something larger than individual concerns. But she didn't miss the weight of carrying other people's lives in her hands, or the way combat missions followed her home in dreams that woke her up reaching for weapons that weren't there. "I miss parts of it," Elena said honestly. "But I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be right now." 2 years later, Elena received a letter that changed everything again. It came through official channels, written in careful English by someone named Maria Santos, daughter of Colonel Santos, the government commander who had coordinated the ground assault on San Esperanza. "Dear Major Vasquez," the letter began. "You don't know me, but you saved my life 2 years ago when you landed your plane in our village. I was one of the children in the church, and I wanted to tell you that because of what you did, I am now studying to become a pilot like you." Elena read the letter 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table while Sophia practiced piano in the living room. The melody was Amazing Grace, the same song she'd been learning during those desperate hours when Elena had been calculating fuel loads and survival. Odds for a mission that shouldn't have been possible. The letter continued with details that made Elena's chest tight with recognition. Maria Santos was 17 years old, top of her class in mathematics and physics, accepted to the National Military Academy, with plans to become the first female fighter pilot in her country's Air Force. She was learning English by watching videos of Elena's post-mission interviews, studying the technical manuals for F-16 aircraft, and working toward a dream that had been born in the moment when a lone pilot had chosen to do something impossible, rather than calculate the odds of failure. "I know you probably receive many letters," Maria had written, "but I wanted you to know that what you did mattered in ways you might not have considered. Not just because you saved our lives that day, but because you showed me that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that everyone else says can't be done." Elena folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with Sophia's school projects and her grandfather's war medals and the other small treasures that marked the important moments in a life lived with attention to what mattered most. 3 years after San Esperanza, Elena was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy graduation ceremony. She stood at the podium looking out at 200 young faces that reminded her of Lieutenant Morrison, bright with possibility and convinced that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle life might present. "You're going to be asked to do impossible things," she told them, her voice carrying across the auditorium with the authority of someone who had discovered what lay on the other side of impossible. "You're going to face situations where the right choice violates every procedure you've learned, where the mathematics don't work out, where the only way forward is through territory that isn't supposed to be survivable." Elena paused, thinking about her grandfather's compass and Sophia's garden and Maria Santos learning to fly in a country where female pilots had been unthinkable, until a desperate mission had rewritten the boundaries of possibility. "When that happens," she continued, "remember that the most important navigation tool you carry isn't in your aircraft. It's in your heart, pointing toward the kind of person you want to be when everything else gets stripped away and you're left with nothing but the choice between what's safe and what's right." The applause that followed was polite but restrained, the kind of reaction that suggested her audience wasn't quite sure what to make of advice that didn't fit neatly into standard military doctrine. Elena smiled, remembering her own graduation ceremony and the absolute certainty she'd felt that flying was about mastering machines rather than learning to trust the parts of herself that couldn't be taught in classrooms. 5 years after San Esperanza, Sophia turned 13 and announced that she wanted to learn to fly. Not fighter planes, too much violence, but civilian aircraft that could deliver medical supplies to remote areas, or transport relief workers to disaster zones, or simply carry people who needed to be somewhere else toward horizons they couldn't reach any other way. Elena signed her up for ground school at the local airport, where Sophia attacked aviation weather and navigation theory with the same intensity she'd once brought to piano lessons and garden planning. On weekends, they would sit together in the small Cessna that Elena had learned to fly during her instructor training, practicing the kind of precision flying that had nothing to do with weapon systems or combat tactics. "Do you think Grandpa would have liked flying these little planes?" Sophia asked during one of their practice sessions, her hands steady on the controls as she executed a landing that would have impressed Elena's first flight instructor. Elena thought about her grandfather's stories of P-51 Mustangs and combat missions over Europe, about the compass that had somehow found its way from his war to her war to this peaceful afternoon above the Arizona desert where her daughter was, learning to navigate by instruments that measured wind and weather rather than moral courage. "I think he would have loved this," Elena said, watching Sophia adjust her approach angle with the kind of instinctive precision that couldn't be taught. "I think he would have understood that this is what all the other flying was for." 7 years after San Esperanza, Elena received another letter from Maria Santos. This time it came with photographs Maria in flight suits standing beside an F-16 that looked identical to the one Elena had landed in a minefield. Graduation ceremony pictures from pilot training, a formal portrait that showed the insignia of a newly commissioned lieutenant in the Air Force that had once been unimaginable for women. "I wanted you to know," Maria had written, "that your impossible landing has become possible for other people. I am now the first of what I hope will be many female pilots in our Air Force, and I carry a compass that my grandmother gave me, the same kind that guided her father through the mountains when he was young." Elena read the letter aloud to Sofia, who was now 15 and working on her private pilot's license while maintaining a 4.0 GPA and volunteering at the local hospital. Sofia listened with the kind of serious attention that Elena recognized from her own teenage years when the world had seemed both vast and manageable in ways that adult experience had complicated. "Do you think you have to do something impossible too?" Sofia asked when Elena finished reading. Elena looked at the photographs. Again, Maria Santos standing with confident posture beside an aircraft that represented capabilities Elena had never imagined when she'd been that age, serving a country that had expanded its definition of what was possible, because one desperate mission had rewritten the rules. "I think she already has," Elena replied, "just by becoming who she is in a place that didn't used to have room for people like her." 10 years after San Esperanza, Elena was promoted to colonel and given command of the training wing where she'd been teaching precision flying to young pilots who came from backgrounds that would have been unthinkable when she'd first learned to fly. Her office walls were covered with photographs and letters from students who had gone on to careers in combat aviation, test pilot programs, commercial airlines, and humanitarian missions that used aviation as a tool for healing rather than destruction. The letter that meant the most was still the first one from Maria Santos, now a captain who was training the next generation of pilots in her own country. She sent yearly updates with pictures of students who reminded Elena of Lieutenant Morrison, young faces bright with the possibility of doing things that looked impossible until someone demonstrated that possible and impossible were just different ways of describing the same territory. Sofia graduated from high school that spring with acceptance letters from universities that offered aerospace engineering programs designed to prepare students for careers that didn't yet exist. She decided to focus on designing aircraft for civilian purposes, medical evacuation helicopters, cargo planes for disaster relief, the kind of aviation that used the same principles of flight Elena had learned in combat training but pointed them toward purposes that built rather than destroyed. "I want to design planes that help people the way you helped people in San Esperanza," Sofia explained during one of their evening walks through the desert behind their house. "But I want to do it by making it easier for other people to help, rather than by doing impossible things myself." Elena smiled, thinking about the different kinds of courage required for building systems that made heroism unnecessary versus the kind of courage that flew into minefields when systems failed. Both were necessary, both were valuable, both required the kind of navigation that pointed toward true north, regardless of how difficult the terrain might be. "That sounds exactly right," Elena said, watching the stars appear in the desert sky that had witnessed so many kinds of human flight, military and civilian, desperate and routine, impossible and everyday. "That sounds like exactly the kind of flying the world needs more of." 15 years after San Esperanza, Elena retired from active duty with the rank of Brigadier General and a collection of commendations that included medals she'd never expected to earn for missions she'd never expected to fly. But the recognition that mattered most was a letter from the mayor of San Esperanza, inviting her to attend the dedication of a memorial garden planted on the site of the old airstrip where she'd landed during those desperate hours when everything had depended on doing something that looked impossible. The garden was designed by children from the local school, many of them the same children who had been hostages in the church 15 years earlier. now grown into young adults who remembered the day a fighter plane had appeared in their valley like an answer to prayers. They hadn't known how to speak. Elena attended the ceremony with Sofia, who was now in graduate school studying advanced aerospace systems and preparing for a career that would use the principles of flight to solve problems Elena couldn't yet imagine. They stood together in the garden as the mayor spoke about courage and sacrifice, and the way single moments of decision could change the trajectory of entire communities. But what Elena remembered most was the quiet conversation afterward with Maria Santos, now a colonel herself and commanding officer of her country's Air Combat Training Wing. They walked together through the garden where tomatoes and peppers grew in soil that had once been marked by tire tracks from an impossible landing, talking about the different kinds of navigation required for military leadership versus the kind of guidance that pointed young people toward horizons they couldn't yet see. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't made that landing?" Maria asked, stopping beside a bench that had been carved from stone quarried in the mountains surrounding the valley. Elena considered the question while watching. Sofia helped plant new seedlings with children who had been born after the rescue, who knew the story only as history rather than lived experience. She thought about the multiplication of possibility that followed from single moments of choice, the way decisions made in desperation could become foundations for futures that looked nothing like the circumstances that had required them. "I think someone else would have figured out a different way to help," Elena said finally. "Maybe not that day, maybe not in the same way, but I think when people need help badly enough, someone always finds a way to provide it." Maria smiled, her weathered hands gentle with the seedlings that would grow into plants that would feed families who might not yet exist. "Perhaps. But I am grateful it was you who found the way that day, because it led to this." She gestured toward the garden, toward the children working alongside Sofia, toward the ordinary miracle of a peaceful afternoon in a place that had once been defined by violence and desperation. All of this happened because one pilot decided that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that looks impossible. 20 years after San Esperanza, Elena was invited to speak at the International Aviation Conference, where representatives from 40 countries gathered to discuss the future of flight. She stood at the podium looking out at an audience that included Maria Santos, now a general herself, and dozens of other pilots, whose careers had been shaped by the recognition that aviation could be a tool for healing as well as warfare. "The most important thing I learned from that mission," Elena told them, "is that the technical capabilities of our aircraft matter less than the moral courage of the people who fly them. You can have the most advanced technology in the world, but if you're not willing to use it for purposes that point toward hope rather than fear, you're just moving very fast in the wrong direction." Elena paused, thinking about Sofia, who was now a senior engineer at a company that designed unmanned aircraft for medical supply delivery in remote areas. Sofia's work was making it possible for doctors and nurses to reach patients in places that had been unreachable, using the same principles of precision flight that Elena had learned in combat training, but applying them to missions that saved lives rather than taking them. "The future of aviation," Elena continued, "belongs to people who understand that the most sophisticated navigation system ever developed is still the human heart, calibrated to point toward the kind of world we want our children to inherit." After the conference, Elena walked through the exhibition hall where companies displayed aircraft and systems that would have seemed like science fiction when she'd first learned to fly. But what impressed her most was a booth run by Sofia's company, where young engineers demonstrated how autonomous aircraft could deliver medical supplies to disaster zones, carry relief workers to remote communities, and provide communication links for rescue operations in terrain that was too dangerous for human pilots. "We call it the Esperanza Project," Sofia explained to visitors who stopped to watch demonstrations of aircraft that could navigate through conditions that would have been impossible for human pilots. "It's named after a village where someone once demonstrated that impossible and necessary are often the same thing. Elena smiled, remembering her grandfather's compass and the way it had always pointed toward true north regardless of how difficult the terrain might be. She thought about the continuation of purpose that connected her grandfather's war to her own, combat missions to Sophia's work-building systems that made heroism obsolete by making help available wherever it was needed. 20-5 years after San Esperanza, Elena received a letter that made her cry for the first time since the mission itself. It came from a young woman named Elena Santos Maria's daughter, named after the pilot who had changed her mother's life by demonstrating that courage was often indistinguishable from the willingness to attempt something that couldn't be calculated in advance. Dear General Vasquez, the letter began, I am writing to tell you that I have been accepted to medical school, where I plan to specialize in emergency medicine for remote areas. My goal is to be the kind of doctor who can help people in places where help usually doesn't reach, using skills that my mother learned from watching your example. Elena read the letter sitting in her garden, which had grown to include plants from seeds Sophia had collected during humanitarian missions to countries where her aircraft had delivered medical supplies and hope in equal measure. The tomatoes were heavy on their vines, the peppers bright with colors that reminded her of sunsets over mountains, where impossible things had become routine through the patient accumulation of small acts of courage. Sophia was now married to a disaster relief coordinator she'd met during a mission to deliver emergency supplies after an earthquake in Central America. They lived in the house next door with their 2 children, Elena's grandchildren, who played in gardens that connected the properties and treated aviation like something ordinary people did to help other ordinary people who happened to live in places that were hard to reach. Grandma Elena, her 4-year-old granddaughter, had asked the previous weekend, why do people say your airplane landing was impossible? Mommy's airplanes land in hard places all the time. Elena had struggled to explain the difference between contemporary humanitarian aviation and the desperate improvisation that had defined her mission to San Esperanza. How could she tell a child who had grown up watching medical supply drones navigate through storms and autonomous aircraft deliver aid to disaster zones that there had once been a time when such missions required individual acts of heroism rather than systematic applications of technology designed to make heroism unnecessary? Sometimes, Elena had finally said, when people really need help and there's no easy way to help them, someone has to figure out how to do something that's never been done before. And sometimes that looks impossible until someone proves it isn't. Her granddaughter had nodded with the serious expression children reserve for concepts that felt important, even when they couldn't quite grasp all the implications. Like when I learned to ride my bike, it looked impossible until I actually did it. Exactly like that, Elena had agreed, thinking about the way individual impossibilities became collective possibilities, how one person's desperate improvisation could become another generation's routine capability. 30 years after San Esperanza, Elena was invited to serve on the board of the International Humanitarian Aviation Foundation, an organization that coordinated flight operations for medical emergencies, disaster relief, and refugee assistance in regions where commercial aviation couldn't operate. The technology had advanced to the point where most missions that would have required impossible piloting skills 3 decades earlier could now be accomplished by autonomous systems guided by artificial intelligence that never got tired, never made emotional decisions, and never had to choose between safety, protocols, and moral imperatives. But human pilots were still needed for the missions that existed in the space between programmed responses and improvised solutions, the situations where someone had to make decisions that couldn't be reduced to algorithms because they required the kind of moral navigation that only conscious beings could provide. Elena's role was to train pilots for these edge case missions, teaching them the kind of precision flying that might be necessary when automated systems failed and human judgment became the difference between successful rescue and tragic failure. Her students were younger than Sophia, drawn from military and civilian backgrounds, united by the understanding that their skills might someday be the only thing standing between desperate people and preventable tragedy. The most important thing to remember, she told each new class, standing in front of flight simulators that could replicate conditions from her San Esperanza mission with perfect accuracy, is that your aircraft is just a tool. The real navigation happens inside you, and it points toward the kind of person you choose to be when everything else gets stripped away. The students practiced scenarios that were designed to test not just their flying skills, but their decision-making. Under conditions where the right choice might violate every safety protocol they'd learned. Elena watched them work through problems that had no clean solutions, learning to trust the kind of internal compass that pointed toward purposes larger than individual survival. Some of them would go on to careers in emergency medical aviation, flying doctors and supplies to regions where disease and disaster had overwhelmed local capabilities. Others would specialize in search and rescue operations in terrain that challenged the limits of what aircraft could accomplish. A few would join humanitarian organizations that used aviation to deliver aid in conflict zones where the presence of medical neutrality was often the only thing preventing complete humanitarian collapse. All of them would carry forward the understanding that flight was ultimately about connection, bringing help to people who needed it, carrying hope to places where hope had become scarce, demonstrating through action that the boundaries between possible and impossible were often just matters of perspective and courage. 30-5 years after San Esperanza, Elena received news that made her realize how far the ripples of that desperate mission had traveled. Maria Santos had been elected as her country's first female Minister of Defense, campaigning on a platform that emphasized humanitarian applications of military capabilities and the importance of training armed forces for peacebuilding rather than just warfare. In her victory speech, Maria had talked about the day a foreign pilot had landed in a minefield to save civilians, demonstrating that military power was most effective when it was used to protect rather than threaten, to heal rather than harm, to build bridges rather than walls. That mission taught our entire country, Maria had said in the speech that Elena watched on her computer while sitting in the same garden where she'd once helped Sophia plant tomatoes, that the strongest military force is one that knows when to fight and when to heal, when to destroy and when to build, when to follow orders and when to follow conscience. Elena had cried again, thinking about the multiplication of possibility that followed from single moments of moral choice, the way decisions made in desperation could echo forward through decades to influence policies and perspectives she'd never anticipated. Sophia called that evening from the field station where she was coordinating relief flights after flooding in Bangladesh, her voice carrying across satellite connections that made it possible for people separated by oceans to share moments that mattered. I saw Maria Santos's speech, Sophia said, and Elena could hear the smile in her voice, even through the electronic distortion. She mentioned you by name, talked about how that mission changed her understanding of what leadership could look like. Elena looked out at her garden, where her grandchildren were playing hide-and-seek among plants that had grown from seeds collected on 6 continents, where the tomatoes carried genetic material from varieties that had fed families in villages she'd helped save during missions that had seemed impossible until they became routine. I think the most important thing that mission taught me, Elena said, is that we're all connected in ways we can't always see. The choices we make in desperate moments don't just solve immediate problems. They change what becomes possible for people we'll never meet, in situations we can't anticipate. Sophia was quiet for a moment, and Elena could picture her sitting in the prefab building that served as coordination center for humanitarian flights, surrounded by maps and weather reports and the kind of operational complexity that had once required military command structures, but was now managed by civilian organizations dedicated to helping rather than harming. Do you ever wonder what Grandpa would think about all this? Sophia asked finally. about the way his compass ended up guiding so many people toward things he never could have imagined. Elena touched the compass in her pocket, still warm after all these years, still pointing toward true north in ways that had nothing to do with magnetic fields and everything to do with the kind of moral navigation that her grandfather had tried to teach her during those long walks through the New Mexico desert. "I think he'd understand that this is what he was preparing me for," Elena said. "Not just that one mission, but a life spent learning how to point other people toward their own true north when the territory gets difficult." 40 years after San Esperanza, Elena was invited to deliver the keynote address at the dedication of the International Museum of Humanitarian Aviation, an institution that documented the history of using flight for healing rather than warfare. The museum's centerpiece was a replica of the abandoned airstrip at San Esperanza, complete with the minefield markers and the narrow approach vector that had required precision flying under conditions that shouldn't have been survivable. But what moved Elena most was the children's section, where young visitors could use flight simulators to practice medical supply delivery missions, experience the challenge of landing aid aircraft in disaster zones, and learn about the physics of flight through games that emphasized helping rather than fighting. The future of aviation, Elena told the audience that included pilots, engineers, medical professionals, and humanitarian workers from around the world, belongs to people who understand that the greatest navigation challenge is not technical, but moral learning to point our capabilities toward purposes that expand rather than contract the possibilities for human flourishing. After the ceremony, Elena walked through exhibits that documented missions she'd participated in and missions that had been inspired by the example of San Esperanza. She stopped at a display about Sophia's work developing autonomous medical delivery systems, looking at photographs of aircraft that could reach patients in regions where human pilots couldn't safely operate. Next to Sophia's display was an exhibit about Maria Santos's military reforms, which had transformed her country's armed forces from an organization focused on territorial defense into one that specialized in disaster relief, peacekeeping, and humanitarian assistance. The display included testimonials from communities that had been helped by soldiers trained to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. But the exhibit that brought tears to Elena's eyes was in the museum's memorial section, dedicated to pilots and crew members who had died while conducting humanitarian missions. Their names were engraved on a wall that faced east toward the rising sun, and beneath the names was an inscription that Elena recognized from her grandfather's war memorial. They pointed their lives toward true north, regardless of how difficult the terrain. As Elena stood before the memorial, she felt the presence of her grandfather's compass in her pocket and thought about the way individual acts of courage became collective memory, how desperate improvisations became institutional wisdom, how impossible missions became routine capabilities that made the world a little more connected, a little more hopeful, a little more willing to attempt things that looked impossible until someone proved they weren't. 45 years after San Esperanza, Elena's granddaughter announced that she wanted to become a pilot like her grandmother. Not a military pilot, too much history there, Grandma, but a humanitarian pilot who could deliver medical supplies to remote communities and fly disaster relief missions in regions where help was difficult to reach. Elena sat with her in the Vaza garden that had grown to encompass most of both properties, where plants from seeds collected during humanitarian missions had created a landscape that told the story of connection across continents and cultures. Her granddaughter was 14, the same age Elena had been when her grandfather had first shown her his compass and tried to explain the difference between magnetic north and true north. "Do you think I'll have to do something impossible too?" her granddaughter asked, echoing the same question Sophia had posed decades earlier. Elena looked at the girl who carried her name but would live in a world that looked nothing like the one. Elena had grown up in a world where humanitarian aviation was routine rather than desperate. where international cooperation was normal rather than exceptional, where the tools for helping people in remote places were sophisticated rather than improvised. "I think you'll do things that seem impossible to people my age," Elena said, thinking about capabilities that were still being invented, missions that hadn't yet been imagined, ways of helping that would require kinds of courage she couldn't anticipate. "But they'll seem possible to you because that's the world you're growing up in." Her granddaughter nodded seriously, then asked the question that Elena had been expecting. "Can you teach me to fly the way you taught Mom?" Elena smiled, remembering the first time she'd taken Sophia up in the small Cessna for practice flights that had nothing to do with combat training and everything to do with learning to navigate by instruments that measured weather and wind rather than moral courage and desperate necessity. "I can teach you to fly," Elena said. "But more importantly, I can teach you to navigate. Because flying is just about getting from one place to another. Navigation is about knowing why the journey matters." 50 years after San Esperanza, Elena was too old for active flying but still young enough to serve as advisor to humanitarian aviation programs that were using technologies she couldn't have imagined during her military career. Aircraft that could fly themselves to disaster zones, delivery systems that could drop medical supplies with precision that exceeded human capabilities, communication networks that connected remote communities to emergency services regardless of geography or weather conditions. Sophia had become the director of the Global Humanitarian Aviation Consortium, coordinating relief flights for emergencies that spanned continents and required capabilities that no single country could provide alone. Her work involved the kind of international cooperation that had once seemed impossible but had become routine through the patient accumulation of shared purpose and demonstrated competence. Elena's granddaughter was now a pilot herself, specializing in emergency medical evacuation in mountainous regions where the flying required precision that pushed aircraft to their design limits. She carried her great-grandfather's compass on every mission, though she navigated primarily by GPS systems that could guide aircraft through conditions that would have been unsurvivable for Elena's generation. "The compass isn't for navigation anymore," she'd explained to Elena during a recent visit. "It's for remembering that the most important direction isn't magnetic north or GPS coordinates. It's toward the kind of person I want to be when someone needs help, and I'm the only one who can provide it." Elena had smiled, understanding that the compass had found its true purpose across 4 generations of pilots who had learned different kinds of flying but the same essential lesson about moral navigation and the courage required to point your life toward purposes larger than individual survival. On her 90th birthday, Elena received a letter from the current mayor of San Esperanza, a woman who had been one of the children rescued from the church 50 years earlier, now leading a community that had become a model for post-conflict reconstruction and sustainable development. "The airstrip where you landed has been converted into a community garden," the letter explained, "where we grow food that feeds local families and supplies that support the regional medical clinic. The old minefield has been cleared and turned into a playground where children learn about the history of our village and the importance of helping others when help is needed." The letter included photographs of the community that had grown around the memory of that desperate mission schools that taught aviation principles alongside traditional subjects, medical clinics that were supplied by aircraft flown by pilots trained in the tradition Elena had helped establish, gardens that grew from soil that had once been defined by violence but was now dedicated to sustaining life. "Every year on the anniversary of your landing," the letter continued, "we hold a festival where children learn about courage and compassion and the way individual choices can change entire communities. This year, we are dedicating a statue in your honor, not because you were a military hero, but because you demonstrated that the greatest strength is often the willingness to help others when helping looks impossible." Elena read the letter sitting in her wheelchair in the garden that had grown to become a small park, surrounded by plants that carried genetic material from 6 continents and told the story of connection across cultures and generations. Sophia's children and grandchildren played among the vegetables and flowers while their parents worked on humanitarian missions that used the same principles of precision flight Elena had learned in combat training, but applied them to purposes that built rather than destroyed. As the sun set over the desert landscape that had shaped her understanding of navigation and purpose, Elena touched her grandfather's compass one final time and felt it pointing toward true north with the same reliability it had shown for nearly a century. She thought about the multiplication of possibility that followed from single moments of moral choice, the way desperate improvisations became routine capabilities, the way individual acts of courage became collective memory that guided future generations toward horizons they couldn't yet see. The last entry in Elena's journal, written the night before she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 91, captured the essential lesson of her extraordinary life. True north isn't a destination you reach once and then stop navigating toward. It's a direction you choose over and over again, in small decisions and large ones, in ordinary moments and desperate circumstances, in times of peace and times of crisis. The compass my grandfather gave me has pointed 3 generations of pilots toward the understanding that the most sophisticated navigation system ever developed is still the human heart, calibrated to point toward the kind of world we want our children to inherit. Elena's funeral was attended by pilots from 40 countries, humanitarian workers who had been inspired by her example, children and grandchildren who carried forward her understanding that flight was ultimately about connection, and officials from San Esperanza who brought soil from the community garden that had grown where she'd once landed in a minefield to demonstrate that impossible and necessary were often the same thing. The service ended with a flyover by aircraft from the Global Humanitarian Aviation Consortium medical supply planes, disaster relief helicopters, and autonomous delivery systems that had made heroism obsolete by making help available wherever it was needed. As the aircraft passed overhead, Elena's granddaughter stood with her own children in the garden that had grown from seeds collected during missions that spanned continents, holding the compass that had guided 4 generations of pilots toward the understanding that true north was always in the direction of hope. The memorial service ended as the sun painted the Arizona sky in shades of gold that reminded everyone present of courage made visible. Elena's granddaughter held the compass that had guided 4 generations toward true north, feeling its familiar warmth as aircraft from around the world passed overhead in tribute to a woman who had proven that impossible was just another word for not yet attempted. In San Esperanza, now a thriving community built around the garden that grew where an F-16 had once touched down in a minefield, children played games that taught them about navigation and courage. The airstrip had become a symbol of transformation, from a place of desperate landing to a foundation for growth that fed both bodies and spirits. Maria Santos, now retired but still teaching young pilots about moral navigation, stood with Elena's family as the last aircraft disappeared into the desert sky. She thought about the letter she would write that evening to her own granddaughter, who was just beginning flight training with dreams of joining the tradition that connected military precision to humanitarian purpose. The compass pointed true north, as it always had, toward a horizon where help was always possible for those brave enough to attempt the impossible. Thank you for joining us on Elena's extraordinary journey from that desperate night in San Esperanza to a legacy that spans generations. Her story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to point your life toward true north when someone needs help and you're the only one who can provide it. Elena's F-16 touched down in a minefield not because she was fearless, but because she understood that sometimes the right thing to do is the thing that looks impossible. Her grandfather's compass guided her toward a truth that every generation must rediscover that the most sophisticated navigation system ever developed is the human heart, calibrated to point toward the kind of world we want our children to inherit. From military pilot to humanitarian legend, from desperate improvisation to routine capability, from one woman's choice to an international movement, Elena's story shows us how individual acts of moral courage can transform the boundaries of what we believe is possible. If Elena's journey moved you, if her courage inspired you, if her legacy reminds you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the situation demands it, then subscribe to Stories of Courage, where silence is never forgotten. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of listeners who believe that the best stories aren't just entertainment, they're navigation tools that help us find our own true north when the territory gets difficult. Subscribe to Stories of Courage, where silence is never forgotten.